All right, so this is a video that is intended to help you guys get an idea about the overall scope of the whole Japan unit. This unit is not as flashy and fun as some of the other units are, but it is really interesting. Japan is an extremely interesting culture. Japan as a country is on my bucket list, things to do before I die. So I'm actually fairly excited about this. There's lots of really cool aspects to Japanese culture and Japanese society that I think are worthwhile learning about. But that being said, let's just kind of jump into it here and see what it looks like. So in your textbook, I'm not going to be spending a ton of time in the textbook today. This is going to be primarily just me kind of giving an idea about what the direction is inside of this unit, how I explain it for the rest of the unit. And I'm going to give you guys just a brief kind of like preamble about an essay at the end of it. So this unit is all about Japan. Now, Japan, as you can see on the map here, is already fairly isolated. I mean, North America, very little chance of contact. Europe and European explorers during this time period are over here and are exploring here and are coming into here and are making contact with Japan. But there is a choice that Japan makes in this unit, which is to go into isolation. Now, that isolation makes perfect sense for Japan, I think, in the context of this time period. Remember, we're still in the same time period as the Renaissance, as the Aztec-Spanish conflict, all those bigger things that are going on in the world, Western expansion, the Europeans going and exploring and trying to find new parts of the world. That's all happening at the time frame in which Japan chooses to go into isolation. So let's carry on down here. So this is just the brief time period. Japan is open to the rest of the world at this point in time, but at around 1600, Japan chooses to self-isolate. Now, we'll go into the reasons why they choose to self-isolate and all those things, and it'll all make perfect sense down the road. There is a point in time where Japan chooses to come out of isolation, and again, there's pressures and things that force Japan to come out of isolation there as well. And then we have a period here, where Japan modernizes. Now, modernization is a thing that lots of countries have had to do. Japan, because of its choices previously, had to do rapid modernization. And then we have modern time period Japan. Now, I just want to highlight this time period between, 1868 and 1912. It's a very, very small window of time, less than 50 years. And Japan, from here, after this time period, like right about here, Japan is inside of World War II with the USA and is giving the USA, a country that didn't have to do rapid modernization, a real run for its money across the Japanese front of World War II. So Japan's modernization, this rapid modernization, maybe wasn't as hard. I'm sure it was hard. I mean, I don't think it was easy, but I don't know that it was quite as hard as one might think. And last thing I'm going to say about the textbook, this is broken up into three parts. The first part is, why did Japan choose to go into isolation? Basically, if I'm going to summarize it, that's what it would be. What was life like during the isolation, and what caused Japan to come out of isolation with the Meiji period? And then last bit is the rapid modernization portion of this unit. So with that being said, I'm going to kind of take the highlight off of the textbook. I'm going to blow me up a little bit. So this unit is really, so the way I frame it, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I frame it around you guys. This unit hopefully makes sense inside of your world. And what I mean by that, I'm not talking about COVID-19 and the self-isolation that we're going through right now, where some of our parents are choosing to isolate and some of our parents are choosing not to isolate, or those kinds of things. I'm talking like you as a student at the Grand Prairie Christian School. So I'm gonna use some vocabulary from this unit that will hopefully make sense to you. But your parents are kind of like the shogun inside of the Japan unit, and your parents have chosen to isolate you. They've chosen to pull you out of the rest of the world and put you into somewhat self-isolation and seclusion by putting you here at the Grand Prairie Christian School. They've chosen to remove some of the outside influences that may not be so great for you, and they've chosen to instead have you refine your faith and refine your understanding of who God is. And they've chosen to take some of the outside pressures of the world away from you so that you can essentially, stew in your own juices. You're able to really become purified as a person of faith. And your parents' choice to do that, not negative, because, I'm a parent who chose to do the same thing for my kids. It does have its impacts. It does have its effects on you as a student. So, we're not going to spend quite as much time talking about the effects for you as a student, but we're going to just talk briefly about why your parents might choose to do that. It could be a number of different things. It could be past experiences at another school where your parents chose to pull you out of that school to put you into the Christian school. It could be just a general desire for your faith to be strengthened and made refined and pure so that you will be able to withstand the pressures of the outside world. There's a myriad of other reasons why your parents chose to put you here at the Grand Prairie Christian School, but your parents did make a choice to not put you at your local regular elementary school or junior high school, but rather to put you here at this time in your life, or maybe for your whole life. I don't know what your particular situation is, but your parents have made a choice. That's very similar to what happens for Japan. So I'm going to give you the entire unit in a nutshell, and hopefully that will all make sense for you. So Japan, as a big overall thing, they had a period where they were inside of the world while still semi-secluded because of their island nature. But eventually they are pulled out by a guy called the shogun, which basically means it's like their king. It's like their ruler. Actually, I should say it's like their king, because they had an emperor who was just a figurehead of the authority of the government. But they had a shogun who actually did the running of the actual government. Kind of like we have a queen and then we have a prime minister. The prime minister of Canada actually does the day-to-day running of Canada as a country. And the queen is a figurehead of the authority that is kind of imbued to the prime minister. The shogun in this situation for Japan is like that. And they had an emperor, and the emperor was kind of a figurehead, and the shogun was the actual one that did the running. So anyways, Japan's shogun looks at what's happening in the outside world, sees the British and the Dutch and the Spanish and even the even the Americans at one point in time, and looks at the outside world and says, we don't want any of that. We don't want any of that coming in and changing our world, our people. And so they made a choice to close the doors. It's called the closed door policy. The isolation policy is that. It's called the closed door edicts. And so they take their semi-open world and they just close ranks and they say, no one is going to get in. Kind of, this will sound a little bit rude to them, but kind of like a little grade, like a preschool kid, like playing hide and seek by being like, if I don't see you, you don't see me. Japan goes into isolation and basically plays that kind of a game. But those choices make some sense for Japan. because they see the way that the outside world is affecting major influencers on them, like China. I'm going to go back to the textbook here for just 1 second. Just based off of proximity, China is the biggest influencer for Japan. Japan is there, China is right here, and China has the biggest influence, and Japan kind of sees China getting taken advantage of by some of those bigger outside powers and chooses to pull itself out, chooses to go into isolation. So that whole choice and that whole decision makes some sense when they see the European powers making decisions for a country like China that is a very powerful country in Japan's eyes. They see some of the way that the ships are floating around their coast, and they say, we don't want any of that, and they close the doors. Now, inside of those closed doors, very similar to the way I described you guys, the way I described your parents wanting some of you guys to refine your faith, refine your understanding of who God is and how God works in your life. The shogun said at one point in time that he wanted his people not to be influenced by the outside world, not to be changed and manipulated. And actually, one of the biggest things that he wanted to drive out of Japan in that closed door edict was actually Christian faith. He wanted that out of his country. He didn't want that to be influencing his people and changing them and changing their belief system from one that, I'll be a little bit maybe judgmental, one that he was able to control, not one that was controlled by someone outside of his country. And so a lot of this unit has to do with a desire for control. And maybe that's another reason why your parents chose. They didn't want an outside influence working against you, working and maybe being in more control of you than your parents were. I know for me, with one of my kids, Liam, he had really negative influences on the outside of our household and of our church life, and those negative influences were primarily from school. And so part of the reason why Liam went from French immersion to here at the Christian school is because we looked at those negative influences and we kind of thought to ourselves, well, if those negative influences aren't so prevalent, aren't so right there, then they aren't going to be able to impact him quite as much. So for the shogun at this time, they make a decision that in their mind is the best decision for their people, and they choose to pull them out of the rest of the world. Now, again, that has some real positives. As we saw with our son, he gets to go in and spend time refining and working on himself and making his personal faith his own, and really kind of refining his understanding of who God is. And we've seen real positive things come from that. So, long and short, I'm going to close this up here with one last thing. One of the biggest strengths that Japan has today, and one of the reasons why it is as amazing as it is today, is because it did self-isolation. Japan is what we would call a monoculture, mono meaning singular. Japan doesn't have a whole bunch of outside influences, a whole bunch of people telling it what to do, how to think. Japan is itself. And Japan knows who it is. And so one of the biggest strengths Japan has is when it wants to do something, it is able to just do it and not have to fight with, as much different entities inside of itself. Like Canada has to make decisions left and right, conservative, liberal, NDP, those kinds of things, and different values and beliefs. Japan doesn't have as much of that. Japan is much more of a monoculture, one thing only that way, and so it doesn't really have to pay attention to the outside stuff. It just is itself. And that's a real strength for it. So, to wrap this up, at the end of this unit, you're going to be assigned an essay. And that essay is going to be not like super stressful, I hope. We'll spend time between myself and Mr. Chabot. We'll spend time probably making some more videos teaching you guys how to write an essay, how to do research, those kinds of things. as we go through the weeks or months, depending on how long this lasts. But that's kind of the framework of the essay. Is the decision to go into isolation a good decision? Is it a wise decision? If you were the shogun, would you make the same decision? That is ultimately what the question on the essay is. Was the decision to go into isolation wise or not? And then you have to research and figure out why or why not it was a wise decision. So until tomorrow, I'm going to sign out here. I hope you guys have a great couple of days off or a weekend or whenever you're watching this. I will see you guys a little bit later on. Ciao.